Welcome to Film at 50, a podcast that celebrates semi-centennials in the world of cinema. I'm your host, Brian Rowe, and I'm so very thrilled to welcome Ben Friedman to the podcast today to talk about Duck, You Sucker, the second to last feature film directed by the great Sergio Leone, released 50 years ago in Italy in October of 1971, later released in the United States in 1972. How are we doing, Ben?
Good. How are you, Brian? Glad to be on here.
Doing well. Thanks so much for being here. It's your first time on the podcast to talk
Yes, thanks for having
about
me.
a movie directed by a very legendary, famous figure, but it's a movie I don't think a lot of people know about. Had you heard of this movie before a few weeks ago?
I had never heard the title you sent me, Duck, You Sucker. I had always heard it called Once Upon a Time in the Revolution, I believe. Is the other name it goes? I think that's the other name.
Okay.
It's supposed to be the trio. It's supposed to be Once Upon a Time in the West.
Yeah.
Revolution and Final One's America, correct?
Yeah. So his third to last feature, one of his best, that's Once Upon a Time in the West from '68 with Henry Fonda. That is like one of the last movies he's really known for. And then his final film is called Once Upon a Time in America, which came out much later in 1984. And I wasn't even sure if he had a movie in between those two, but there is this one. And I was like, why is this one not called Once Upon a Time in the Revolution? What I found online, Ben, is that the alternate title for this movie is A Fistful of Dynamites.
Yes, that's the other title I had heard it called.
Was it released elsewhere as Once Upon a Time in the Revolution? Like that actually was the title?
That's a great question.
It should have been.
And so I just know it because, again, I've seen it called Once Upon a Time in the Revolution.
Okay.
I'm trying to see online if there's anything about it. I don't see anything about it, but like I said, I've always heard of it a part of the Once Upon a Time trilogy.
Yeah.
So that's all I had always understood it.
Yeah, Leone has like an early film from, I believe, like the very early part of the 60s, which is unrelated, I think, to anything else he directed. And then he does the Man with No Name trilogy with Clint Eastwood, right? Those three films. And then he only has three more after that. And so it would make sense that it's kind of like his second trilogy. And Duck, You Sucker does not sound like it would be related to either of these last films.
Yeah, and we'll get into it, but the title itself is kind of just misleading because it's kind of a joke in the movie, and when you hear it, you kind of think it's going to be a little bit more of a comedy than it is.
It sounds like it's that title,
it sounds like a spoof.
It sounds like it's a Western spoof made by like a Mel Brooks or something.
That's exactly the same vibe I was going. Duck, You Sucker.
It's not a random title. We hear Duck, You Sucker at least 4 or 5 times throughout the movie. It's not like you get it once at the end or something. It's something that James Coburn says a lot throughout the movie.
He says it a lot, and it's like his quote. But like I said, in the film, or I guess his other films, Leone's other films, you hear their titles and they have kind of these epic Western, the good, the bad, the ugly, A Fistful of Dollars. Just all these. And then you're like, Duck, You Sucker. And like I said, when you told me this was a Leone film, I was like, what? Really? No clue.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if he was more prolific or less prolific. And as we talked about before we started recording, I mean, he really didn't direct very many films in his long career. And we'll get into him a little bit more later. We're going to talk about the movie in a moment. But before we get started, Ben, I asked this of every new guest, like, what role has film played in your life? And what are a few of your favorites, just in general?
You know, film has always played a really big part of my life. Just since I was a child. Television, I have some love for it, of course, but movies has always been it for me. Like, I'm someone who has trouble like sitting down and watching things for a really long period of time. So TV kind of just hurts me because it's like, a new series I start up on Netflix where it's like 9 seasons. I'm just like, I don't have the patience for it. Definitely if they're like those 45-minute dramas each, and I'm just like, I can't do it. Film for me is so easy to digest, because even max, like the longest film I'm watching is like 4 or 5 hours max, and that's like the Gandhis, of the world. So that's why I just really enjoy film. It's something that I can put on and it has a start and an end that feels satisfying. Not always satisfying, but in theory it should be a satisfying experience.
Yeah, I always think of it as like a short story versus a novel. In some ways, like watching a 2-hour movie is like a short story, and then if you want that longer novel, you put on a 7-season television series on
exactly. And that's so, like, as someone who's always been busy, who's always, I'm still younger, so just came out of college like a year ago. Film was just the easier thing to digest because it's like, okay, I only need to dedicate like 2 hours right now. So growing up, the films that I remember loving specifically, because you have to understand, my parents were from LA, and then I moved up to Sacramento when I'm 6 months old. But a lot of their friends were in the film industry. One of them, my dad's roommate, was Chris Durand, who starred in Halloween H2O.
Oh, H2O. I've met him.
Yes, he's Mike Myers
at
in
a
that
convention.
Film.
Yeah.
Yes, he's Mike Myers. One of my dad's other friends, I think is Chris Showerman, I believe was his name. He was George of the Jungle in the second straight to DVD George of the Jungle film, George of the Jungle 2. So like, I've always had these connections with film, and it's always made me super interested. Chris Durand also, by the way, is a stunt double for Brendan Fraser, which always led me to one of my favorite films as a child growing up was Looney Tunes Back in Action. He was the stunt double for Brendan Fraser in that film. And it's the Looney Tunes Back in Action specifically has a lot of Hollywood movie references and all that, whether it's the Batmans, Doctor Who's in there, all that. So it's that just really just cemented my love of film, was that Warner Brothers style of films. Then you have the Who Framed Roger Rabbits. I love these crossovers, these like of all like my animated characters in one film. So those were really the big ones. I'm a historian, so another one that just played a huge role in my life was National Treasure's Chew Book of Secrets, because I've always been like such a huge Lincoln, Civil War, and conspiracy buff. So like to bring all those together, and a huge Nicolas Cage fan. We're doing something on my podcast right now where we're trying to go through 2 Cage films a week, which is just maddening. But
like in order, like chronological order?
Just completely random order. We're just whatever one sounds like the most fun to do that week. But the reason I bring up Nick Cage is because you have this in National Treasures Chew, just the Nick Cage energy of the conspiracy theories, Abraham Lincoln and all that. So it just really made me appreciate that film. And that's the film that like made me become a historian. Was like, I truly just like love what not the message of the film, but the ideas of the film, being able to play around with like learning history and all that. And it's just like, to me, it seemed like the most glamorous thing. But yeah, so those are a lot of my like big movies. If I had to throw in one other one, the 2 other big ones in my life is Back to the Future, which is the first movie I remember getting on DVD from Netflix when they still mailed you DVDs. That one just changed my life. I was in 6th grade and just absolutely loved it. And the other one is, of course, Star Wars. I'm a huge Star Wars fan. I host a Star Wars podcast everything. And Empire Strikes Back, I've seen it hundreds of times. I've seen it at the Hollywood Bowl performed by a live orchestra and all that. Like I said, Star Wars is my life and all that. But yeah, so movies have really just played a big role in my life. They get me through the good times, the hard times. I was fairly sick like 2 years ago. So Jojo Rabbit was a movie that I'd always play to kind of uplift me. That's actually a tattoo I have, is the quote from the movie. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. Just keep going. No feeling is final, which is the quote at the very end used by Austrian poet. So
that's so awesome. So you like the quote you love from that movie, you tattooed on your arm.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Very much. So yeah. So like I said, I am just a big movie guy. And really, like I said, movies is for me just that way of escaping reality sometimes. So that's why I do this. I love talking films, and I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks so much. Those are some great choices. It's funny you mentioned National Treasure 2, because I only saw that one once in the theater, but I've seen the first one like 10 times. So do you prefer the sequel?
Yes. Like,
interesting.
I love the first one as well. But like I've seen it maybe like in my life, maybe 3 or 4 times complete. I've seen National Treasures 2, Book of Secrets hundreds of times. I'm not kidding. I've literally
Hundreds of times.
Literally, I can put that movie on in the car and not have to watch the movie and can just listen to the audio. And I know every scene. I know all the jokes coming. Literally, to me, it's like the easiest comfort movie in the world. It's just something I'm familiar with. And it brings me joy for whatever reason.
Interesting. I'll have to watch that again. When did that come out? 07, I think.
07, 2007.
Yeah. So it's been a long time. I don't remember much of the second one. I'd like to check it out again. I'm also a huge Nicolas Cage fan. He's getting great reviews for his new movie Pig, which I haven't seen yet.
I gotta see it. Yeah. I really want to see it.
Yeah, we'll see how it does this fall, like into spring in the awards conversation. But I'd love to see Pig, and
I've had that
rooting for Nicolas Cage.
I'm always rooting for him.
He's everywhere. He's in like 3 or more movies a year, but it's been a while since the last really good one, right? And
Spider-Verse was like his last role where you're just like, oh, this is like really what Nick Cage can deliver.
Yeah. Mandy I like Mandy a lot. That was on Shudder.
Mandy's same year, I think. Mm-hmm. I couldn't get into that film. It was a little too out there for me.
It's a little tough to watch at times.
Cinematography in that film is just some of the most beautiful color work I've ever seen on film, period.
Yeah.
But I just grabbed his other movie. I meant to watch it when I was in Texas, but I didn't. It was Willy's Wonderland. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I saw the title. I'm a big fan of Willy Wonka, and I'm like, are they related in some way? Or are they completely unrelated? Okay.
It's him trapped in a Chuck E. Cheese style like restaurant.
Oh, okay.
But at night, all the mannequins or all the animatronics come to life and try to kill him.
So there's really nothing he won't do at this point.
Yeah. And can I tell you, it looks brilliant.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check that one out too.
Yeah, it's been on my list.
I mean, obviously Star Wars and Back to the Future are such huge movies for all of us. Anyone who loves film, I mean, those are 2 landmarks. And Back to the Future, if it's not in my top 10, it's in my top 20. I mean, that is like a near perfect movie with like a just fantastic screenplay. Like, I think I've only taught screenwriting once, and I had to use as one of my examples Back to the Future because it's just so brilliant, the way it's constructed and everything. And to think that movie was almost going to be starring Eric Stoltz.
I know, that's such a weird casting choice for that movie because nobody to me that could do that role but Michael J. Fox. I think he's absolutely pitch perfect. And Christopher Lloyd, I was shocked when I got older to discover that he was like 40 when he did this film. Like he's one of those actors like Steve Martin that's always just looked old to me. And then like I watch like Three Amigos and something, and it's like, oh, this is like Steve Martin at 35.
Oh yeah, Steve Martin's another one who just since like the late 70s has looked pretty much the same. He has that gray hair, which I'm worried about because I'm going gray already at 23, and I know by like the age of 30, I'm just going to be like, okay, it's all gray because that's how my parents and grandparents were. Well, I got my first gray hair at 23. Actually, it's the first time I noticed one, and I'm 36. I got mine at 16. It's more down here on my chin than it is up here. Yeah, luckily my chin's been avoiding it. My beard doesn't have it, but the top of my hair, oh my gosh, when I cut it down, I'm just like, there's so much gray. Like I said, I got my first gray at like 16, I think, and it's just been going downhill since. I think you'll be fine. Yeah, hopefully. Do you like Westerns at all? Like when you were younger, did you watch a lot of Westerns? Like, do any come to mind? So here's the thing. I do not like Westerns at all. You don't like Westerns? This is the one genre of film that like I can get into every other one and have like some enjoyment. Westerns, there's really like, I've seen a handful. Yeah. You know, my grandpa, when he was still alive, was obsessed with these films, this Clint Eastwood, the Sergio Leone. I'm sure he owned this one. Guarantee you that he did. But it was just never my jam. There's very few that I like. My favorite Western of all time is Unforgiven. Yeah, mine too. Clint Eastwood. I just think that's a perfect film, and it's also just a perfect deconstruction of the genre and a brilliant look at brutality and just like the pain that violence leaves behind it. Yeah. Besides that, I mean,
my dad's a huge Tombstone fan, so I've seen that one a handful of times, but it's not one that I particularly
that one's
appreciate.
a little overrated for me. I like Tombstone. I think people love on it a bit too much.
I think Val Kilmer's like really funny in the movie, but that's about it. But I mean, so Unforgiven's up there for sure. I have a love for 310 to Yuba. Yuba, is that what it's called? 310 to Yuba.
310 to Yuma with an
Yuma.
M.
That's right, Yuma. I'm from California North, so Yuba is a city up by me. That's why I always get confused. But yeah, Yuma is a fairly fun one. Mainly because I'm such a big Christian Bale fan.
Yeah,
I just appreciate it. Besides that, I mean, Blazing Saddles is a really good Western, I guess, if we're going by like that. But besides that, like, I really just don't have a particular love for this genre. And I've tried a few times. I've tried with some of the old Clint Eastwoods. You can't get me into any of the John Wayne stuff. It's just too
John Wayne.
It's too far for me.
Yeah, though John Wayne. So in what was it, 2016 or 2017? Every year I pick a director and I watch his or her entire career in chronological order. And I think it was 2017. I did a year of John Ford, and I watched everything he made from like the 20s to the 60s. And that was the first time I really got an appreciation of the Western genre. And I actually do think John Wayne did some really cool things and some good work with John Ford. I'm not one to just put on any random John Wayne title and have a great time for 90 minutes. But I think when he has a great director like John Ford, like The Searchers from the 50s, I believe it's 1956, is a great film. Really beautiful. I saw it on the big screen once. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and some of these films that Ford did with Wayne are really great. And I've talked about a couple Westerns on the podcast so far. Monty Walsh from last year is one of my favorite movies, that kind of favorite discoveries I made for the podcast, with Lee Marvin and Jack Palance.
Yeah.
And then Little Big Man, we talked about with Dustin Hoffman. Both of those episodes, my guest was our mutual friend, Forrest.
Yeah. Forrest is a big Western fan, if I'm correct. He's way bigger than I am.
Yeah. I don't think it's his favorite, but when I was like in my teens and my 20s, I would say if I had to pick like my least favorite genre, it'd probably be Westerns. I was never that into it. But as I get older, I do feel like I'm starting to kind of become more interested in the genre. And the more films I see of like the 60s and 70s in that genre, I'm starting to really like a lot of what I'm seeing. So
that's fair. I need to give Westerns a little bit more of a chance, because for instance, like I saw Unforgiven the first time, I think when I would have been like 15 or 16.
Okay.
And I didn't like it at all. And then going back on it when I'm 23, I'm like, okay, this is not just a great movie. This is, to me, best of the best. One of my all-time favorite films, just like really got it. But like I said, the other ones that I've tried, like it really takes something special to me for me to grapple on. I have the same issue actually that I have with Westerns that I have with medieval like swords and sandal films.
Okay.
And it's a lot of the times, and this isn't going to sound great, but it's like when all the actors kind of look alike and kind of sound alike, it's hard for me to differentiate who's specifically in like British sword like fantasy films, like like Lord of the Rings forever took me forever, because I'm like, who are all these characters? And like they all have swords. Like I'm like, if you, like the dwarves are easier, but then the humans, it gets confused and all that. King Arthur, I had some of that issue with Guy Ritchie's film, where it's just like, who exactly am I looking at again? Or like, who is it? Game of Thrones drove me crazy, because I'm like, I don't remember who this person is. And like they all sound alike and they all are doing nefarious things. And it's like, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Whose story is he in? But so that's kind of my issue with Westerns too. It's just like maybe it's the dialect. Maybe it is sometimes solely the dialect of which they speak, that I'm just like, it's just a disconnect for me. It's like, I have to pay way more attention to it.
Sometimes it's hard when you're dealing with a time period that we're not really familiar with, that we don't recognize. It can be hard to get involved. That's why I also struggle with like historical costume dramas, like kind of slow costume drama set in like the 18th, 17th century. Like I have to be in a certain mood to get through it. Like,
totally.
I can't do it. But then I discover a movie like Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick a few years ago that I'd never seen, and I loved it. And so then that got me on a like trying to find all that I could around that time period.
It's always funny finding those films. Like for me, when it was Unforgiven, when I found that, I always like, now it's like, all right. And I type into like Reddit, like, what movie is just like Unforgiven? Like what are the other Westerns titles that if I like this, that I'll probably like this one?
And what's interesting about the early 1970s, even though I have talked about at least 2 Westerns before this, I mean, this is not a great time for Westerns, like the early to mid 70s. I mean, I'm sure every year I'll be able to find a couple that I can maybe talk about on the podcast, but this is not like the golden age of Westerns by any means.
This is kind of the dying age of Westerns.
Right? I mean, especially you get into like the 1980s. I mean, I'm trying to like, what's like a famous Western from the 80s? I mean,
1980s.
Clint Eastwood did 1 or 2. He did, I think, Pale Rider from 85. Like Clint Eastwood's in 1 or 2 from the 80s. But yeah, you don't like from now until Unforgiven, like the next 20 years.
Oh, you're forgetting
which one am I forgetting from the 80s?
The one with Bon Jovi. Top Gun, not Top Gun. What is it called? Young Guns. Young
Guns. Yeah.
And Young Guns and Young Guns 2. I think Young Guns 2 might be 1990.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, I don't think any genre ever truly dies. There's always going to be a few examples every decade, but between like 71 and 91, this is not like, like a stellar time for the Western genre. Yeah. And I think the fact that neither one of us had even heard of this movie, I think says a lot because, I didn't love this movie as much as some of the other Leone movies I've seen, but there's a lot of like really great stuff going on here. A lot of great power and depth and some really cool action scenes. And there were some moments in this movie I was like, how have I never heard of this one? Why is his other films, why are those always the ones talked about by everybody? And this one I'd never even heard of, as we'll get to. So for those of you who don't know what this movie is, Duck You Sucker, which is at least one of its titles that went by at the time. And this is the brief synopsis, kind of just what the movie is about. So it takes place during the Mexican Revolution of the 1910s. The leader of an outlaw family named Juan, played by Rod Steiger, meets an IRA explosives expert on the run named John, played by James Coburn. Seeing John's skill with explosives, Juan persuades him to join him and his fellow bandits in a raid on the Great Bank of Mesa Verde, but the raid does not go as planned, and that's only the beginning. And in the movie, it's kind of an odd friendship between these two guys, right? Because they should really be enemies.
Yeah.
As the movie goes on, they form this kind of bond and a connection that leads us all the way to the emotional last scene of the movie. Anything else you wanted to add to that short little plot summary that you think the listener should know about?
I don't know about but I would definitely, the idea of it being the Mexican Revolution is very key to this film, and specifically what the Mexican Revolution stood for and who fought in it is a very specific idea in this movie, because this film does talk about like what are the costs of a revolution, what is the sacrifices you make, and who is actually leading the revolutions are big themes in this movie. It is a very political movie in its nature, and I think people need to go into that understanding that this isn't just a typical Western.
No, this is not just a typical revenge like
this
Western you see.
This is almost more of a war movie that just happens to have the Western tropes in it sprinkled throughout.
That's a good point. I never thought of it that way, but you're right. It's more of a war film in some ways than it is a Western. Yeah, absolutely right. So here's some research about the movie I found very interesting. So as you said before, this is kind of thought as like the second part of his final trilogy of movies. And this is Sergio Leone's final Western. His last film, Once Upon a Time in America, is like an historical film. It's not a Western really. It's like set in New York with Robert De Niro and a really great cast. So let's see, this film, Leone offered the role of Juan to Eli Wallach, a great actor. He had already committed to another project, but Leone begged him to play the part. Please be in this movie. So finally, Wallach said, okay. He dropped out of that other project and said to Leone he'd do it. He'd do Duck You Sucker. However, the studio already had Rod Steiger signed. And so Wallach ended up not being in the movie. Leone offered no compensation to Wallach, and Wallach later sued, as he should have.
Yes.
Right?
It's interesting. That's another theme we see is actor Hollywood disagreements. I mean, what is it right now with Scarlett Johansson? So I mean, themes, maybe Hollywood doesn't change as much as we think it does.
Yeah, this episode will be dropping like late September, so I don't know what the development will be with Scarlett Johansson, but as we record this at the end of July, Scarlett Johansson has sued Disney over like profits she might have lost from Disney putting Black Widow on Disney Plus. And so I don't know how that all works, but
yeah. And it's now a trend because rumors are Emma Stone will be soon following, which means Emily Blunt could easily follow because she has Jungle Cruise.
Yeah. So by the time this episode is dropped, there's going to be a lot of actors who have made potentially some big money.
Yes, potentially.
We'll see by September, October how many
and maybe
actors come forward.
And I want to make sure I'm not criticizing the mouse. If you still want to sponsor me, Mickey, like feel free. You can find me. I just want to make sure to my overlords that they know.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I try to go into every movie pretty, I don't want to know much about the plot. I don't want to know much about the trivia. I don't know why, but somehow that piece I had read that before I started watching the movie yesterday. And so I was kind of watching Rod Steiger, thinking about what Eli Wallach could have done with this. And I could kind of see like the other performance
where they'd go.
Absolutely. So then the other lead of the movies, played by James Coburn, he had been offered roles in A Fistful of Dollars and Once Upon a Time in the West. He was offered the role of John by Leone, but he was reluctant to take it. It took a dinner he had with Henry Fonda, who was in Once Upon a Time in the West. He asked Fonda what he thought of working with Leone. Fonda said he considered Leone one of the greatest directors he'd ever worked with. So Coburn later took the part and has had nothing but great things to say about the experience and being a part of the movie. So it took Henry Fonda to say, give him a shot, give him a try.
Everything always takes the Fondas to convince you. But you know what? This role of James Coburn, and specifically, it feels like one of those roles where it is specifically written for him. Like you really
more so than Steiger.
Yeah, where you're just like, Leone obviously clearly wanted to work with this guy, and he wrote this character a specific way that would entice James to come in.
And I like the idea that all the way back to like 63, 64, Leone was going after Coburn and Coburn just kept turning him down. I like that there was this project that Coburn and Leone got to work together, at least at some point.
Yeah.
So that it worked out. The film was not initially planned to be directed by Leone. Did you know this? Leone did not want to direct this movie.
He just was going to produce and write it, correct? That's what I thought. He was
going to produce and write it. He wanted originally Peter Bogdanovich to direct it.
Who is that?
So, and in 70, I mean, this opened in Europe in late part of 71. Bogdanovich, his first breakthrough movie, The Last Picture Show, did not come out until the fall of 71.
Oh,
so I'm kind of so in the 60s, Peter Bogdanovich was a film critic, and he, I think, went to a lot of sets and interviewed directors. Like I think he interviewed like Hitchcock. He interviewed all of the big talented directors of the 60s. So maybe it was a matter of that. Maybe he had interviewed Leone, and in 1968, Peter Bogdanovich's first feature was released, starring Boris Karloff. That movie is called Targets. Super underrated, really good film. He's most known for The Last Picture Show and Paper Moon. Have you heard of Paper Moon from 73?
Yeah, now that you mentioned his work, I'm like, okay, that.
And he's also in The Sopranos. He's also an actor. He shows up in some big projects.
That I didn't know. That's good trivia. That's good trivia.
But so originally I don't know why he would have thought of Bogdanovich for this, but doesn't seem like in his wheelhouse. But yeah. But later it was Sam Peckinpah that he wanted, and that makes sense. I mean, the Wild Bunch came out in 69, and that was like the first real like bloody kind of, was it R-rated? It was like a little bit more mature, bloody Western from 69. But Peckinpah fell through, and then Leone wanted his assistant, Giancarlo Santi, but both Steiger and Coburn said, we will not make this movie unless you, Leone, direct it. They would not participate without him. So he reluctantly directed the movie. I'm like, why was he so reluctant? He wouldn't go on to direct anything else until 1984. So was this a case of like, he'd made a few Westerns and he felt like he'd done it, and now I'll just sit back and write and produce like George Lucas kind of did in the 80s and I'll just produce. Maybe that's
maybe it's just easier on him.
Yeah,
just to produce it.
So that's interesting to me. I mean, you never want a director to come into a project like that unwillingly. Like a movie like this, it's 2.5 hours long. It's a huge production. Like that's not something you want to be like, well, okay, I guess I'll do it.
Yeah, and at times, I don't want to get into my critiques of the film, but maybe it's because he just knew it wasn't as like not cohesive, but like maybe he's just like, maybe this one doesn't ring as special as some of my other ones.
Once Upon a Time in the West is so extraordinary that it's hard. And you know, this we've talked about on the podcast, M. Night Shyamalan and The Sixth Sense, and gosh, what was the other one we talked about recently? We talked about with Forrest Hartman. We did an episode, it will have dropped by now, about Citizen Kane and Orson Welles, and how when you have just a near perfect or perfect film right at the beginning, how do you top it? How do you follow it? It can really be debilitating for directors when you start so strong.
And some would argue that he had like 4 perfect films like in a row. So it's just
I mean, really, I mean, they are so beloved. A Fistful of Dollars, For a Few Dollars More, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West are so great and so beloved. Many people consider those 4 movies 4 of the best Westerns ever made.
Yeah.
That I could see Leone being like, well, I've kind of done it.
I've done all I need to do in this genre. What do I have to prove anymore?
Do I want to do one that's a little bit less? And maybe it was one of those situations where he had these 2 actors on board and he's like, well, am I just going to let the whole thing fall apart? No. So I will do it. And so, so and this would be the last Western he ever made. So it's kind of interesting how that worked out. So a few other things. Leone and Steiger did not get along while making this movie.
Really? Their chemistry is quite good, but that actually shocks me.
No, not the actors. The director Leone and the actor.
Oh, sorry.
Steiger.
I thought you said.
No, I thought you said
Coburn.
I think Coburn and Steiger. I think they were friends.
Okay. That
the director and Steiger. Leone was initially dissatisfied with Steiger's performance and what he was doing. As a result, tensions rose numerous times, including an incident that ended with Steiger walking off the production, the scene where John destroys Juan's stagecoach. However, after the movie was said and done, Leone and Steiger were ultimately content with the final result, and they made up and everything was fine.
Yeah, that now that you say it's the director, main actor, that doesn't shock me because it's Steiger, correct, you said, who wasn't supposed to be in this film.
Yeah, he did not. Leone didn't want Steiger. That was a studio thing. He wanted Eli Wallach. Yeah.
So I mean, I've been on sets before, and I've heard stories from sets like that. Instantly, just draws issues. Like that's just instantly when you know the person making this film and the creative force behind there doesn't want you there. You're gonna have a little bit of an ego about it. So the fact that they seem to have made up is fairly impressive because usually you don't hear that.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, I don't know, like I've made films and I won't name names. There was one short film I made in college with an actress who was so difficult that it's making a movie is hard enough. And when you have someone who you want to collaborate with for whatever it was for that movie, I think I shot that over like 3 weeks. And by the end of the filming, it was like hard to just find her and get her to like do the role. And it's like that just makes it 1,000 times harder. So if you don't have that connection, that good working relationship with your lead actor, especially, it's really tricky. And it's hard to make a good movie when that's right. The chanting of Sean, that memorable score by Ennio Morricone. I was
brilliant
wondering,
composer.
Was that? And yeah, as we'll talk about, I think my favorite thing about the entire movie is the score by Morricone. I loved everything about the score, and this guy is talk about, I mean, productive and prolific. Ennio Morricone, if you look him up on IMDb, I believe he has more than 500 composing credits. And in the 70s, it's like 15, 20 titles or more every year. And mostly Italian productions. He doesn't really start doing American productions until like the 80s with like the Untouchables and some movies.
Such an underrated score, the Untouchables.
Oh yeah. So yeah,
Such
so he
score.
would eventually kind of start doing more work for like American films, but around the early 70s, it's mostly like Italian productions. But boy, his score here is so phenomenal. And that Sean part of the soundtrack was the suggestion of Carla Leone, who thought it would sound better than the original wah 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 chants that I guess he had originally composed for the movie, and that I think might have been, you know, something similar to stuff he had done before. Morricone himself has said in interviews, the chants in the movie of Sean do not represent the names of characters, but are just part of the soundscape, like the chants in other Leone westerns. Because I don't know about you, but it sounded close enough to John. I was like, it's, and they happen often in like flashback scenes with John, and I thought maybe it's like a take on his name, but I guess it wasn't. So that was, I thought that was interesting. Yeah. All right, so two final things. The longest available version of Duck You Sucker is 157 minutes long.
Oh, perfect.
That's the version I watched. Is that the version you watched, the 2.5 hour?
Or did you watch then yes, one? I did watch the 2.5 hour version.
But
there was a shorter one.
Yeah, as I'm going to get to here. So Leone confirmed in an interview that his original cut was 40 minutes longer than that. So I guess there was a version of over 3 hours.
The Leone cut.
That was test screened to audiences before he had to make cuts. He also said most of those cuts were made in the first half of the movie. There were rumors and very detailed reports from many people who claimed that the longer version of the film was shown in parts of Europe during its initial theatrical run, but I don't think it has survived today. I don't know if it's available anywhere. In the United States, this is kind of interesting, like this, for all of 2021, we're talking about films from 1971. In some way, this is the first movie released in 1972 that I'm talking about, because technically it opened in Europe and some places in Europe in the fall of 71, did not come to the United States until the summer of 1972 in a 2-hour version.
Okay.
So not, it's like 118 minutes. So how many minutes is that he cut off? Like almost 40 minutes?
Like yeah, approximately 40 minutes.
So if you watch the 118 minute version, you're technically watching a version of the movie that's 80 minutes shorter than the first cut that Leone wanted. Many scenes in this version were cut because they were deemed too violent and too profane or politically sensitive.
Did you know that the beginning scene, I'm assuming your version had it too, where it's the quote from, is it Mao?
Oh,
I think.
Okay. Yeah. There was a quote at the beginning.
Yeah, the quote from Mao. It's cut in the US version completely.
Oh, it is?
Because it's isn't that I want to say it's the quote from the guy who was leading the Chinese party at the time, Chinese Communist Party. Am I crazy?
That would make sense.
I think that's the guy.
Probably.
But now I want to do more research into it, but I think it's like the communist.
Yeah, it was. I did find online. I think I found online. I'm trying to remember. Was it the 40 minutes that were cut from the longer version that we watched, or was it the scenes that were cut from the version we watched that they released in the United States at the 2 hours? But there is something online you can see what scenes have been cut.
Yeah.
So you can check that out. So in the US in 72, theatrical prints were generally of poor quality. The film was marketed as a light-hearted spiritual successor to the Dollars trilogy and was released. United Artists reissued the film after, so originally it was released in the United States as Duck You Sucker, was not successful. They reissued the movie later as A Fistful of Dynamites, which was meant to recall A Fistful of Dollars.
Fistful of Dollars, exactly. Because Duck You Sucker is just it's funny how often you just hear a title and you can just judge the movie completely on the title and am I ever going to see this? Duck You Sucker is one of those ones where it's if it's not marketed as a full-on comedy, there is no reason for me to be there.
It is a terrible title in general, and it's a terrible title for this movie. I was at least happy to hear duck you sucker 4 or 5 times throughout. So it's not just completely random.
Yeah,
if we never heard it in the movie, I'd be like, what? So it's a part of the film, so it's okay in that regard. But it's not a title that I'm thinking of audiences in the summer of 72 in the United States. Like, that's not going to attract.
That's not going to connect.
It's not going to attract an audience, first of all, and it won't attract the right audience you want for this, I don't think.
Yeah, and it's like also has that problem where you just hear the title and you don't necessarily get the feel of the title. Like sometimes like the best titles, like, oh, this is going to be this, like A Fistful of Dollars, like kind of the vibe.
Yeah.
The good, the bad, and the ugly shows that perfect black, white, and gray that this movie, the ambiguity that lives in.
Yeah.
This, you have no clue. We just did the Nicolas Cage movie, Bad Lieutenant, Port of Call, New Orleans, which is just another terrible title.
Yeah.
Just because it doesn't flow at all. And it's like, you don't realize how important a movie title is until you have a bad movie title.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And sometimes, I've heard stories, like sometimes it's not necessarily like the director like gets the final say in what the title is. Sometimes the director wants it to be called something and the studio says, no, we're going to call it this. So I couldn't find, was Sergio Leone on board with the title Duck You Sucker? I could not find that. But I cannot imagine he was.
No, I think from my understanding, that's his title.
That's from the title he wanted from the get-go.
Remember, it's in Italian is the technical.
Oh, right.
So like maybe in Italian, like Italian, this is just like,
it makes more sense.
It's just like a great title. And then translated, it's just
translated doesn't work.
Yeah.
So you're probably right. That's probably what happened.
Yeah, that's probably what it is. I wish I could speak Italian so I could pronounce it correctly. But
so I'm
hoping it sounds better.
I prefer A Fistful of Dynamite, except if this is thought of as the second part of the final trilogy, Once Upon trilogy, it doesn't make sense that this would be a fistful of something if it's not related to the previous trilogy with Clint Eastwood. So
that's exactly where I prefer the idea of the title of Once Upon a Time in the Revolution.
Once Upon a Time of the Revolution or in the Revolution, something like that, I think would make more sense. It's not exactly, I don't know if that pulls in audiences either, because that's kind of like a mouthful. But
it is, but it worked with the West and it would work with
I think you're right. That would be best. All right. So Ben, what are our thoughts in general about Duck You Sucker?
I've already been pretty sarcastic about the movie, so I am actually going to compliment. So let me again preface this that I'm not the biggest fan of Westerns. I'm not this prolific in like Leone's filmmaking. I understand the influence that he has and the filmmakers now that look to him and draw inspirations from him. So I can at least appreciate some of the aspects within this movie. And I am going to give credit where credit due. I think the first 20 minutes of this movie are fantastic.
Oh, right.
The opening scene. I always like to start with the opening scene because that's what sets up a film and the tone right off the bat. Yeah. And right off the bat, I think you get this introduction to the character of Juan Miranda that is great at setting up the tone, the politically charged nature of this film, the fact that he's in this like room that has a bunch of rich, snooty people who are basically just talking down on him, criticizing him, and just, look down on the poor in general. So I think it does. And then it has that switch where you kind of have Juan Miranda and his band of bandits come in and just take over. Yeah. And we're going to talk about later with films that this kind of reminds me of, but you could really see Tarantino, his favorite filmmaker is Leone. And you can see the first 20 minutes really reminded me of the first 20 minutes of Inglourious Bastards, where it's this character coming in and automatically he has the screen. He just controls the presence and you're kind of scared of what he's going to do because we're learning who he is and what actions he's willing to take. And, this is a deconstruction of Westerns. So that Leone is always fan of the spaghetti Westerns. He does it so well at the beginning by setting up like this guy is not a hero by any chance. Like one of our first introductions is he rapes that woman at the beginning. Like, so we know where he is and who he is.
He's not a good dude.
He's not a good dude. And that's the actions that go throughout the whole thing. So it shows this moral ambiguity that is great because when the film talks about war, where the film's message is about the moral ambiguity that goes into fighting war,
Mhm.
revolutions, it's great to have this character spearhead us because he's almost an extent those ideas being talked about in the film.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, did you like the movie overall?
No,
Past that opening 20
no,
minutes, past then you were struggling.
no, I didn't like the movie at all. No, I'll
Okay.
just be full on honest. This was not a movie I particularly cared for and will probably never see again unless I'm going back and doing a
Leone retrospective.
Exactly. But generally, I did think this introduction was well done.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these ideas are really cool. Like this idea of the revolution. What does it mean?
Mhm.
Who's it fought for? What are the ideals and what is the price?
Mhm.
I think those are really great story points and ideas to have in a film that otherwise was poorly executed. And I'm sure you're going to talk about it too. But the thing that really slows down this movie, it is pacing, and specifically pacing is ruined with the flashbacks with
Oh, right.
What's his name's character?
With John.
Yeah, with John.
John's flashback to happier times.
It's so campy, I think, in its execution.
Yeah.
That like it just feels honestly just of a different movie, and tonally it's just like doesn't fit in with the grit that is in there. Had you taken those scenes out and kind of hurried the story along, there's maybe at least something more I can gravitate. Again, it's not my genre, but at least like it keeps the movie kind of going. A lot of the time for me in this film, it was kind of just meticulous to get through at times where I'm just like, it's just too long. Like I would edit this a lot.
Yeah,
it's my personal opinion, of course.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because I kind of like the flashbacks because it's like one of the few parts of the movie where it goes a little bit more operatic, which Leone is kind of known for, and it's a lot of slow motion, and I feel like a lot of the movie is hard to get through because it just all looks the same. There's nothing really striking about the cinematography. It moves very slowly. There are scenes of the two lead characters just talking that go on and on and on and on, and you're like, okay, let's move this along. So at least in the flashbacks, we got like a glimpse of like John's former life, and we could like get a little bit of style that sometimes we don't get in the movie. Yeah, I would agree. This is much lesser Leone, and usually I'm all for the definitive longer director's cut, like I am with his last movie. Like it's really famous. The famous thing about his final movie, Once Upon a Time in America, is 4 hours long.
Yes.
And then I believe they brought it to the United States in like a 90-minute cut or something, like that Leone had no part of. Like they just said they cut like 2.5 hours out, and it apparently is unwatchable. Like it makes no sense, and you have no idea what's going on. I have seen the 4-hour cut, and it's spectacular.
Yeah,
I am not against long movies if it's really good. This movie is painfully long. This movie should have been 1 hour and 40.
I feel the same way.
You know, maybe 2 hours. So I would be kind of intrigued maybe later if I'm having a really just boring evening. And I'm kind of intrigued by the 118-minute cut. And like, because it sounds like what did I read? That most of the cuts come from the first half. And as you say, the opening 20 minutes are really great. And I was actually very excited at the beginning. I was like, okay, this is going to be interesting. Like, this is kind of our lead character. He's not a good guy. Like, this is not like a hero's journey kind of a movie that we're used to. And I thought Coburn was especially very good in the movie. Like, I liked what he brought to this. He's a very charismatic actor. I did not really, after maybe the opening 20 minutes, as you talked about, you know, Rod Steiger, I liked in things here and there. I didn't think he had enough presence to carry us through a 2.5 hour movie. Like the amount of running time he's in this movie. I think that character might have been better suited in a more supporting role, and had Coburn been more of the lead of the movie, I think it might have been better. I don't know about you. Did Rod Steiger work for you in this? I mean, first off, it's hard to watch kind of that brown face, right? Like an actor, he's playing a Mexican, and that was something they did all the time in Western.
Yeah, that's always hard to watch it. It's just
which would have been the same case with Eli Wallach.
Yeah, too. Any character that you were going to have, or any actor you're going to have in that, you just run into those problems with the 60s, 70s, 50s, obviously. basically earlier on. So obviously that stands out.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna really touch on that much more than that, but
Yeah.
It's not that Steiger didn't stand out to me.
Mhm.
It's that I didn't think his character
It's part of the screenplay.
had enough to do.
Mhm.
Like a lot of it, it's just like he's this reluctant hero for most of it.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think the shift where he actually becomes truly, I guess, the more hero role
Mhm.
towards the end of the film, I didn't understand why that character would do this and why he would kind of stick around when he really shows no interest in any of that.
Mhm.
So it's just kind of this gap between what this story is about and then versus what he actually has to do in this film. And then a
Mhm.
lot of it really, it's not that he disappears, it's just that the story around him is so much bigger
Mhm.
that you don't get that time to really be with this character and understand
Yeah.
him personally. Like the story is about the events going on, not about Miranda. And I would have liked that a
Mm.
little bit focused more. If we're gonna be with this guy for all the movie, let me understand who this character is in the context of this
Yeah.
war.
Yeah, the motivations of the characters aren't always clear the way that the motivations are always clear for me in pretty much every other Leone movie. Like sometimes it was a little unclear to me, like, what exactly does he want here? And because every 30 minutes, the movie kind of shifts gears a little bit and their friendship becomes a little bit different. And I was always like, wait, are they working together for this part? And then there's a section of the movie where Coburn just disappears. There's a part where he's just gone. And I'm like, okay. I agree. I think the movie leaves Steiger at a good place at the very end. He does have kind of a shift in kind of his motivations that I like, but sometimes it's not, as you say, super clear throughout the movie. And yeah, I don't know. I couldn't really put my finger on it. I don't know if like the movie needed a third lead character or something, but it just after a while, I mean, there's a lot of scenes of those two guys talking, and I'm like,
you know what it is? I think honestly, while I agree with you that Coburn was the far superior character, or Coburn as an actor, Malloy the character, I think that backstory and development we get with his character, a lot more of that should have been placed on Miranda's character.
Oh, right. Okay.
So that way, at least, like, again, I want to make sure you have like obvious like motives for a supporting character. I don't think you should devalue him, but there was a way to, I feel like, take some of that big amount of screen time that we got for those flashbacks and maybe give a few of those.
Yeah, that's a good
to
point.
Miranda's character, so we at least know him, and it makes some of those emotional decisions he makes at the end either more cathartic or at least more understanding.
Yeah, because we really do see the movie more through Steiger's eyes than we do Coburn. So why are we getting 3 or 4 or more flashbacks with Coburn, but not with Steiger, who has more
screen time?
Screen time overall? That is kind of a weird choice. Why do we only get flashbacks for Coburn?
Yeah,
I wonder why Leone chose to do that.
Yeah, that was one of my big things that I noticed, where it's just like we're really getting a lot for Coburn, but Miranda, like besides that opening, you don't get much other not huge character development, but at least huge understanding of this character.
Yeah. It is a film I admired at times. There are some big action set pieces that were really stunning, and we get like that bank robbery that turns out not to really be a robbery. It's more of like getting the prisoners out, and there are moments, at least 1 or 2, where we think like one of the lead characters is going to be shot or killed, and then something happens. We hear "duck, you sucker," and then they're safe.
Yeah, this is again where I'm talking about appreciation of a film. This is where I can really take an appreciation of a film and understand it and really like it. Some of the cinematography, I know you said it at times it felt a little flat to you.
Yeah,
I think, and this is definitely a style with Leone in specifically. Am I pronouncing that right? Leone?
You know, I'm actually not 100%, but my entire life I've pronounced it Sergio Leone. So if I'm wrong, it's my bad.
Okay, so it's good. That's what I had always pronounced it too, but I kept saying it out loud. I'm like, is that actually right? But I think what he does really well, and I'm trying to find the cinematographer, Rossellini, I want to say is his name. Rossellini. Not going to even try to pronounce that first name, so I apologize. But there is something really cool that he does with the camera when it zooms into the people's faces, and we're getting the dialogue from only a section of the face.
Mhm.
And one, as an actor, that's really challenging to do because you have to convey that emotion, but without your whole body. You're literally using a small section of your face that has to basically encompass the weight of that storyline at that time. But on the same point, the cinematographer also has to capture in a way that shows that emotion. And in that, I think it's actually done pretty brilliantly. Just the way they are able to convey these emotions with literally no more than like a nose and a mouth at times. Like there are times where it's just like, why is this off centered? That was another like where I'm just like, okay, this is his style, something that you've seen Tarantino now, of course, use very commonly. But like, so this is his style, but it's just like, wow, like you are literally getting the dialogue for like 5 minutes, and all it does is flashing back to the faces of these characters back and forth. So it really shows at times the intensity of it, because when you see these characters, like their facial expressions, like either if it's the eyes bulging or the little sweat everywhere, you're like, wow, you're really in the moment, and it captures it really well. So there's ideas like that with the camera work and stuff like that that I appreciate. And I mean, you already mentioned the score, which is brilliant score.
Oh, it's astonishing. It's like it's better than it has any right to be.
Exactly. It's some of these ideas that I'm like really a big fan of. Another one is just like the score, why am I blanking on the other one?
And I believe real quick, Morricone, I believe he scored, maybe if not the very first movie, but I believe he scored everything else that Leone made.
That is my understanding.
Like they're very, like they had a really good working relationship.
And he ended up winning his Oscar a few years ago, correct, for Hateful Eight?
Yeah, I believe he got a like life achievement Oscar in like the 90s or the 2000s, and then he won. He passed away in 2020.
Oh wow.
Ennio Morricone. Is that you're talking about Morricone, right?
Yeah, Morricone.
Yeah, he won like a competitive Oscar for The Hateful Eight by Quentin.
That's what I thought. He finally got his.
Yeah, and he was there at the ceremony. I remember like John Williams was nominated that year, and
for Force Awakens,
they all stood up and clapped as he went up to the stage. That was a really cool moment. I mean, think about it. The guy was composing
90 plus, I think, when he won that Oscar.
Yeah, I mean that was like I think the last major film that he scored, and so
that
was just a really cool kind of big final award for him.
With his score, it's just like it gets the tension, it gets the pace, it gets the adrenaline of scenes. It does the action, but mixes it with the Western and with that Spanish influence at times. It's just all really brilliant.
Yeah, the introduction of Coburn. There was like a new sting on the soundtrack that was great when we see Coburn for the first time. And and did you like it in that final flashback at the end that goes on for like 86 minutes of the how many kisses does he have with?
Oh my good Lord.
The only like what gets me through that is the score, which is beautiful. And I'm like, okay, I don't know if we need to see Coburn kiss that woman 4 times.
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe it was an actor's recommendation. Let's redo the scene. Let's redo it. Let's try again.
Gotta do that one again.
Yeah. But like I said, so there are these technical elements of the film that I can't appreciate. And you see how different styles of filmmaking now have borrowed it. Obviously, I've mentioned Tarantino, but even those face shots are very, they resemble anime with the eyes, and Edgar Wright was doing that with Baby Driver and some of his later work, where it's just the focus on the eyes, this small section to convey the emotion. I do like these techniques, and it definitely feels like he is I'm not going to say he's the only director that really did this back then, but he's definitely the most prolific, where if you're thinking about the classic, obviously the standoff with faces is always like a big one with the eyes and the glares and all that. But I think he does it just so brilliantly well. Like I said, a lot of this film is technically brilliant. It just comes down to the screenplay that just isn't interesting. Like
it's like too convoluted or something. There's too many ideas going on here, and sometimes that can be a good thing when the director is throwing a lot of stuff at you. But in some places, I just wanted to like just get a little bit more simple. like I wasn't quite sure like what the motivations were and where we were going next, and where I never feel that in any of his other films. Like I always know exactly what's happening in his other work. So I don't know.
Yeah, and like I said, for me, it was the flashbacks that ruined that pacing that you're talking about right there. But there are certainly, like, even within the flashbacks, like, I'm not the biggest fan of slow-mo. I think it has its place certain times, and I think some directors do it way better than others. I'm an apologetic Zack Snyder fan, so like his use of slow-mo I think is fairly brilliant at times. In this one, to me, it is just at times just slow-mo to be slow-mo, where it's just like it's there and it's like, why is it there in this scene, and why are these scenes being dragged out so long? That was another issue I had watching this film, where I'm just like, why are we in this room for like 10 minutes?
But there are scenes that will go on for 10-15 minutes and you're like, this
and there's like
5.
There's no dialogue in some of these scenes. Like there's like a scene of them just purely walking in like the cave or something underground or whatever. I forgot exactly where they're walking to, but I think it's where they're setting up the dynamite and whatever. And it's just like, okay, like I get like as a director, it is always cool to do something where it's just like, oh, you get the scale of it, like, oh, you're walking through this way and that, like you get the whole picture. It really does geographically, it puts you in there. As an audience member, it's just like, okay, like I don't need to like know that this tunnel goes on for a while. Like you can just place the bombs, like you can cut to him being there at the end, because it's not like the other issues. Like, you know, we talked about Miranda's character not having those scenes. What if you gave like the walking exposition in those scenes, like they're walking and then they're explaining something that adds to the characters? Instead it's just them silently walking to like put bombs down. You're just like, why is this necessary?
I think part of the problem, it kind of goes back to what we talked about last fall about the director David Lean, who made Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago, a guy who like later in his career, he didn't really know how to make a shorter film. So then he makes Ryan's Daughter, which comes out in the fall of 1970. And it's this quiet, intimate love story. And the movie is 3.5 hours long. And it easily, we talked about it on the podcast. You can go find it. Like there were a lot of things I admired about the movie, but it felt like a 2-hour movie that was dragged to 3.5 hours because that director had made 3-4 hour epics the last few pictures before. And I think that's kind of the case here because Sergio Leone, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and Once Upon a Time in the West are, if not 3 hours, approaching 3 hours. So I almost don't know if by Duck You Sucker, he has an idea of, is there a way to make this a really fantastic hour 40 that like Monty Walsh, a Western we talked about last year, that I think that film was barely 90 minutes. And if that movie, which I really loved and was on my top 10 of the 1970 movies I watched, if that movie had been 2.5 hours, it would have been too much. And there's a lot going on here. I don't know. I think 90 minutes is too short, maybe for this movie, but 2 hours and 37
2 hours
minutes
feels like the time
that
you need to be in.
And when I start to feel it, when I'm looking, I'm like, how much longer do we have to go? And it's like 1 hour and 37 minutes more to go. I'm like, oh boy. And on one hand, I'm like, well, he didn't make 80 films. Like, he only made a few films. So on one hand, I'm like, well, this is kind of cool. A film that Leone made, I didn't know of. And it's almost like a one more little piece of the puzzle for the filmography of Leone. So I was like appreciative of that. It exists. And there's this other film that he made between Once Upon a Time in the West and Once Upon a Time in America. But it is like, for sure, like I haven't seen his first movie. I don't know much about the first one, but of everything else I've seen, it's a lesser film than anything else I've seen him do.
Yeah. I apologize for bringing it back to Zack Snyder real quick, but I have like, there are some filmmakers where it's just like the style that they bring into it. Like if that connects with you, you can just sit there and kind of just eat it up, like without like paying attention to the time. For me, that's Zack Snyder. For me, it's just like I can watch Watchmen, the new Justice League, not 300. I'm not a big 300 fan, but like his new film, Army of the Dead, all that stuff. I've seen Legends of the Gahul, that owl one he did.
Oh, okay.
Where it's just like, I can just sit there and eat it up. Like, that's just like, because I like the style that he brings in the filmmaking. And I like how he incorporates the comic book feel to it. But like, I also understand when I showed my mom Justice League, the 4 hours was just way too long for her. Like just far too long for her, even though I could sit there almost all day and just sit there and
He
just
could
like
have
kind
made
of
that
marvel.
movie
10
24
hours.
hours
He
long.
could have made that a whole day experience, and I would have sat there totally fine. That's the thing I have with Leone, where it's like, okay, I can appreciate and understand why he's doing it, and why, if you're the biggest Leone fan, like why this film is cool, because it's like, oh, we get to see what he does, and why what he does at times with a very different story that it conveys a little bit more comedy at times than other of his films do, and like aren't as reliant on the what's it called, the standoffs, you know, the classic Western duels, that doesn't fully actually at times rely on the Western tropes for the most part in this film. It's cool to see that this director play in a different genre. However, if you're kind of like me, where I just don't have, I have an appreciation, but I don't necessarily have a love for these styles of films, to me, it just felt grating, where it's just like, I really need this to be over.
Yeah, and there are big fans of this movie. If you look at IMDb, I mean, there's a top review that says the best movie nobody's seen.
Yes, and Reddit, I always look at Reddit for older films just because I know just everyone usually has an opinion somewhere there. And like the great thing about Reddit is like it's a bunch of people kind of just arguing on a forum, so I just kind of get to read everything like with retrospect. So that's where I saw it, and a lot of people were calling this like an underrated masterpiece.
Yeah, because of the title, it's an underrated masterpiece Leone fans need to seek out. And I picked this movie for the podcast assuming it was going to be great. I had a feeling that this was going to be really cool, and I was kind of disappointed. And I have to be honest here. I have to say that I did feel the length, and even Coburn, who I liked more than Steiger in this. I mean, they're not two of the best drawn characters of a movie I've seen Leone make. I just think, like, if given the choice, I'd much like rather watch Once Upon a Time in the West, which is just a much better time.
Yeah, and for me, like some of the ideas that are talked about, like with this moral ambiguity in this main character, it's like, okay, but I've seen Clint Eastwood do that same role better in one of your other movies. That's what it's like some of the issues where it's me, where it's just like, okay, but I know this is like what you do, but like, you know, Clint Eastwood mastered this role. And I'm not saying these two roles are exactly similar, but there's enough shades of these roles that feel close enough, I guess, where you can kind of just look at it and be like, okay, is this really, I guess, the best use of this actor?
Yeah, I mean, I like some parts of this movie. I like the ending for the most part. Like, we get that big explosion at the end, and I went, oh my God, they're really going there. And then it cuts to I'll just give it away. It cuts to Steiger's face, and then it goes, duck, you sucker. And I'm like,
oh my God, that last line he
takes
had
you out.
is the stupidest like ending to a movie.
Yeah.
I forgot what he yells at the end. But it's just
but the emotion before of them having that final eye-to-eye contact, and
that's
even
so
though
good.
that flashback goes a little too long,
it goes way too long. But it's like, I totally agree with you. Where it's
there's
just
an
like
operatic, emotional feeling I had at the end that I was like, well, at least we've led somewhere really spectacular here.
This ending is great, and then it has that moment where it's just like, it just camp. It just feels corny to all hell. And I'm just like, this isn't
and I forgot at that point that it was called Duck You Sucker, and I went, oh yeah, that's the title.
That's another issue where you're just like, it's the stupidest title, and it just comes back to like ruin it again.
Yeah, and every time I think of that title, I just think of have you seen the movie Bowfinger with Steve Martin and Eddie Murphy? Yes. I just think of gotcha suckers from Bowfinger. I don't know. It is what it is. You know, we can't change the title now. Some movies are just named what they are. But so I think if you're interested in Westerns, if you are a fan of Leone, I think you have to watch this once. You might like it a lot more than we did, because there are some people who are more interested in that genre and Leone's work. You might get some more out of it than we did. So I don't want to tell our listeners who might be semi-interested in this title, like, don't you dare go watch it. You might like it more than we did. You know, I don't know.
If you're a fan of the genre, there's certainly a good chance that you will 100% enjoy this movie more than I did. If you're a fan of the genre, like, sincerely, like,
it's not a throw. This is not a throwaway movie where you're like, oh, Leone was having just an off day and he phoned it in, and he's not doing anything wasn't his of interest. Cash grab. This is not that. Like, there's a lot of richness and some interesting things going on here. And if you're into that, I think you might like it. So I wouldn't tell everyone to not watch it. I think if you're interested in this director and the subject matter and that genre, you might want to take a look. And if nothing else, if you don't like it, like we didn't really like it, stay for the Ennio Morricone score because it is beautiful. And I want to find it. I want to find it.
If you can find it on vinyl.
I don't know if it's available for this movie, but I want to find it.
Yeah. And I'll say for people who are maybe a little hesitant on watching this film, if you are a screenwriter, really, if you're working in any of the industries in Hollywood or have an interest in that, go look at it because one, there are interesting ideas being pulled with how the camera moves, with how the actors are portrayed, with the writing. So watch it in that to understand. And then if you have the same issues that I have with it, critique it. Like, why do I have this issue with this character? Where does it go wrong? What would I change specifically? Because that's how I think you become better at anything, is being able to look at something and critically analyze it and say, yeah, this is what I would have done differently, or this is why I have an issue with it.
Yeah,
that's exactly. That's why I enjoy watching films that like I appreciate but don't love, because it's like, where's that disconnect of why I don't love it? Like, why can I greatly appreciate a movie, which I do greatly appreciate this movie, but have no love for it?
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective for sure. So my last question, Ben, I asked of every guest about the movie. If they were to make Duck You Sucker now, if someone took this story and these two characters and they made a new version in 2021, what do you think would change about it? What would stay the same? How would this movie look in a 2021 version, do you think?
Just to clarify, this is not the question where I name the movies.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's at the end of each episode, I asked like because cinema has changed so much over the last 5 decades. We talk about like because there's we still get a lot of remakes and stuff, and they and executives and people, they love IP, they love stuff. Not to say that this would necessarily translate to that, because not a lot of people know about this movie, but if they were to take this story at least and translate it to a modern film, whether it's set in historical times or not or whatever, what do you think it would look like now? Like, how would it be different?
I totally understand. And I love this because we do a very similar thing on my podcast that we call it The Great Debate, where my co-host and I will ask each other questions and we just have to go on the fly and answer them.
Oh, okay.
So this is kind of a pitch for me. So first, to me, you need a director who captures some of the same visual abilities, but also has, I guess, a little bit more connection to the story being told. So the first name that came up to my head was Alejandro Inarritu. I believe is how you pronounce them, from Birdman and The Revenant. You see, I think in that you see that not politically charged, but certainly I think he can do that politically charged nature of the film. We saw in The Revenant, he can do the scope of war really well, but also in The Revenant, while we have this huge scope of this film, which is a revenge film, it is able to focus on Leonardo DiCaprio's character and tell his story completely, but without sacrificing any of the grandiosa of the overall story.
Yeah, so I love The Revenant. It's great.
Yeah, movie. So I think you're getting a Mexican actor or a Spanish actor.
Yes, that was my top thing. Get a Mexican actor.
That's the guaranteed thing. There's no way this film gets made with, like, let's say
Nicolas Cage in blackface.
Yeah,
brown
face. It's not happening. Like this, you need an actor of the ones I was thinking of. I know he is an actor that I quite love that has not gotten the attention he deserves, and now I feel bad because I'm blanking on his name. Joel Garcia? No, it's
Gael Garcia Bernal.
Yes, is he the guy from Coco?
Old?
Yes, and Old.
Yeah, Gael Garcia Bernal. He would be great.
He'd be great. And I saw him in a movie years before, Rosewater, Jon Stewart's directorial debut from 2014. Right. He's the journalist in that film. I think he can convey that weight needed in this film to get going. And like I said, I think the nature of this film from the 1970s is still completely relevant today. How many films have we seen that talk about the cost of war and revolution and why we fight those and who fights those? How many movies give that? We get movies like that all the time. So I think, and honestly, it might be even more relevant than it was back then. Like right now, it definitely feels like there's a relevance for those types of stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I would really lean on to that. I would
Mm-hmm.
really lean into that aspect of the film, of the story, and see what can be done to greater emphasize those points.
Absolutely.
I guess. And again, just remove so much of the.
Yeah, I think it should be tighter, right? It should be a tighter
for
narrative.
sure.
And I think the flashbacks would have to be played with, either cut completely or those would have to be, in terms of.
I think you cut
pacing,
them.
You could just cut them.
I think you cut them and just have it
at this time, yeah.
And let them just have conversations at time, like while they're walking or doing. Like you could do some of those exact same scenes and just put that dialogue between those two, because it's more emotionally impactful when you see a character reacting to someone telling you a story.
Yeah. And you can get Gael Garcia Bernal, Damian Bashir, Oscar-nominated actor from I think it's called A Better Life from a few years back, is another great actor. He'd be fantastic. And
I was thinking Oscar Isaac was the other name that was like kept going around, where I'm like, he could do something really interesting.
And then I think you could get a really great A-list actor to play the Coburn role. I mean, like it would have to be really, like, you'd have to find actors that had some electric on-screen chemistry there to really make the whole movie work. And I think you could find those two actors now. I think
it would be so easy to find an actor with that has that same charisma, but yet is also able to convey the weight of the story.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think the action scenes would be a little bit more visceral. There'd be a little bit more violence, and I think there'd be more style from the director. And I think the film overall would just be tighter. I think that's why I want Inarritu specifically to direct this style of film, because I think what The Revenant does show is he does have that great visionary and pacing. Yes. Revenant's 2 hours and 45 minutes, I think, maybe 2 hours. But it does 50. Not feel it. It doesn't feel like that. No. It's such a quick pace thing. And it tells so much of a story with just Leonardo DiCaprio like laying there in pain. Yeah. A lot of the movie is just him, there's long stretches without dialogue, but it's fascinating. And they also, with the moral ambiguity point that Leone plays a lot with in this film, we know that he is able to direct a performance like that because Tom Hardy in that movie he's not just a simple black and white character. He's a very gray character as well. And now that I'm pitching it, the actor that I would say is for Coburn, or if that's how you pronounce his name, I'm blanking on it, Michael Keaton for the Coburn role for John. Yes, because is he supposed to be Mexican in the film? I thought he's supposed to be an American. I thought he was an American. The John is an American. I mean, those flashback scenes, like that's he's just an American, right? Yeah. So I'm pitching Michael Keaton. Maybe it's because I like Michael Keaton in movies. Yeah. But I think he definitely has that like kind of same swagger. Yeah. But also the emotional weight. So there we go. We got it. So that's my pitch off. Inarritu. We got our cast. Let's make it happen, and then change. Yeah. What do we change the title to? Literally anything else. Okay. Yeah. All right. So that takes us to our final two segments, Ben. Yes. The first one's called the Divine Double Feature. So someone has sat through, hopefully they had a better time than we did, 2 hours and 37 minutes. What do you suggest a more modern film that they put on right after to make a really cool double feature? Okay. This one's going to be a really outside answer, but I think I like it a lot. Mm-hmm. I have talked a lot about like the ideas of this movie that I really like is the focus on the revolution, the war, the people who fight it, and the sacrifices made. Let's flip that and then get to see the movie about the people who are making these decisions and using the people like pawns. So my pitch is the 2018 Christian Bale-led biopic comedy Vice. Okay, that is a wild choice. So why Vice? So here's, again, I think the two actually have a lot in similar. They are both stories about conflict and how people deal with that, and stories about wartime. Now, true, one of them is the politics of wartime, literally in the place where all power is being held. And then the other one is the soldiers and the peasants and the people, the commoners
having to then fight these wars and have these conflicts
Mhm.
and all that. And I get that the Mexican Revolution and the Iraq War are two very completely different styles of war in and of itself. But I think the message that oh my gosh, why am I blanking on the title? Duck You Sucker. Oh my god, it's such a bad title. I couldn't even think of it off the top of my head. And I just finished watching it. But I think the message that the two main characters have in Duck You Sucker, where it's talking about like, oh, like this is the cost of the revolution. This is what we're the people fighting it, all this stuff. Like it's that same message is in Vice, but Vice is like, it's not glorifying these two, but it's kind of shows the ridiculousness of these people leading these things where it's like, oh yeah, we're just going to do this because it's our egos going at it, just kind of this. So that's why I like these two pairings, because I think they are actually quite similar, not in what these films, I guess, the style of these films, but what the film's message is about. I think is a really interesting double feature, because again, it is really just the juxtapositions between the people versus the ones leading. So I think you get, again, I don't want to say a whole picture because these are two very different wars and countries, but you get an idea of just the moral ambiguity that goes within war and how politically charged it is and how just morally gray it is at times.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really did not expect to like Vice. I wasn't sure, and I really loved it. Like it made my second 10 of 2018. I got close. I think I think it went like 20 minutes too long at the end. I remember thinking it was like really great, and then at the very end, I was like that part where he like talks to us. I remember I'm like, oh, I don't know about this part. But yeah, when those credits rolled halfway through the movie,
I thought it was the funniest thing.
That was, I think, the loudest I've laughed at a movie in a long time.
Totally agree. I think Vice is maybe not underrated because it is a very unconventional biopic.
Yeah.
But I think there are certainly ideas, messages, and topics that are touched in Vice that I think are really interesting. And at times, the reason I also like it as a double pairing is because it has some of the same issues that Duck You Sucker have. Where it's just like pacing is a little off. There's too much like talking at times. It is just a lot of just like characters just walking, and you're just like kind of watching that. So at times it's interesting because the filmmaking style is similar enough. Again, not in genre, but just in like the issues that I have with the film. But also the messages are very, again, not similar, but have shades of that overlap, I guess.
Interesting. Yeah, I went with more obvious choice, more modern Western. I've seen it twice. It's really great. And that's from 2007, The Assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, which is also kind of about a relationship between two men who, like that kind of frenemy aspects, and, superb performances by its two leads, Brad Pitt and Casey Affleck. And it's a slow film. When I first saw it on home video, it took me kind of a while to get invested in it, but when I saw it again a few years later, I came to really enjoy it. And I think there's something about that relationship between those two men in that movie that would make it kind of an interesting pairing with Duck You Sucker. So I would suggest
yours is definitely probably the more conventional choice. Mine feels like
I usually go conventional.
Mine feels like more of the like, I'm trying to write a college essay. And like really just kind of want to talk about Vice. But like, have to figure out how to like tie it in. I think
like, because my thinking is always like, let's look at something fairly similar, but made 40, 50 years later. How has cinema evolved? How does the film look under these two different directors, one who's making his film in the 70s, another one who's making kind of a similarly themed kind of movie in the 2000s. How do they look different is always kind of how I think of the Divine Double Features. That's usually the
that's totally fair. How I think of like when I hear questions like that specifically, just to kind of show why I picked Vice, is like when I always hear of reboots, remakes, or all this, I always look at the movies for the original source material and say, what does this movie talk about? And if you were to just completely change this movie, like, what is this movie at the core of it? What is this story about? And the story is about conflict and war and revolution. Okay. So it's like, that's why I saw Vice, where I think Vice is inherently about conflict and war.
Yeah, no, that's a great idea. And I think it's important to take it in new directions and not just kind of pick an obvious choice. I mean, occasionally I can't remember what movie it was, but there was a very slow, somber drama that was long. And I said, well, honestly, a good double feature with this, after slogging through this for as long as it is, would be Bridesmaids.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think you could watch another long drama. Like, I think you'd want something funny. And sometimes I do go in that direction too. But yeah, it's just fun to think about how cinema has changed over 50 years, and
for sure,
in different kinds of like playing with those ideas and all of that. So fantastic. All right, our final segment, Beyond the Flick. This might be the one and only time I get to talk about the career of Sergio Leone. And if it's Leone, I apologize to our listeners. I've been saying it the wrong way the whole time. I just always have said Leone my whole life.
I've always said Leone as well.
I feel like I've heard Quentin Tarantino and others talk about him. I feel like I would have been, oh, that's how you say it. So I think it's Leone, but just let me know if I'm saying it wrong. I'll get it right the next time. But yeah, so have you seen any of his other movies?
I have seen probably most of the trilogy with Clint Eastwood, The Man with No Name.
Yeah.
My character in World of Warcraft from years ago is named Manco, which was like a nickname, I guess, that they had for the Man with No Name. So I'm familiar with those movies. The reason I say most of it is because I know for a fact it has not been in like 1 or 2 sittings or whatever. It's been like, I remember seeing parts of it with my grandpa here. I then saw like clips on YouTube. I've seen this scene. I've seen that scene. I've seen like half the movie on like TV. So it's like, I've probably at this point seen most of those 3 movies. Okay. And I want to say I've seen Once Upon a Time in the West, but I'm not positive. It's again one of those things where there was like one year where I was just seeing like 5 movies a day. Just because like I had that.
Yeah, I had that too. Yeah.
Like where I was in high school and like just getting C's, so I didn't care.
Yeah.
Where it's just like I was just watching films. So it's like I want to say I saw it the same day as I saw Eraser with Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, okay. Nice double feature.
Born Identity. And like, I don't know if you're going to know this. It's a movie called Bad Company with Chris Rock
and Anthony Hopkins.
So that's what I mean.
Directed
like
by Joel Schumacher.
Yeah, because I used to go to this DVD store that just had
random movie.
So I would just grab it. So I'm like, oh, okay, like I know this movie's fairly famous, and I just watched them all in like a row. So it makes it really blurry, but long story short is yes, I think I have seen Once Upon a Time in the West as well.
Okay,
but can't tell you anything about it.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to his brief career as a director, I mean, it's like 7-8 titles, not very many movies. Really, the only one that has disappointed me is the one we talked about today, Duck You Sucker. Everything else I've seen of his, I like or love. And I think a great way into his work is the Man with No Name trilogy. Because I'm trying to remember, I believe A Fistful of Dollars and For a Few Dollars More, the first 2 movies with Eastwood, I think are shorter. I think they're like 90 minutes to 2 hours. I don't think, and they're much more simple kind of stories. Like there's like revenge, and we kind of follow this no-name guy, and he has interactions with groups of people. It's like the first 2 movies are very simple. Like, and it's not like a lot of political stuff and long ramblings. Like they're fairly tight, the first 2 films in that trilogy.
For sure. And it's very palpable because we know who Clint Eastwood is, and we know the films that he's made. So especially if you're a fan of Unforgiven, you can see with the tropes that he's playing with in these earlier films that would then lead him to play a character like he does in Unforgiven. So I think it is just easier to digest getting into it when you have an actor that we're so familiar with, who has kind of been a part of even my life being younger. Like he's been a big part of like growing up. Like those movies are still culturally impactful. Clint Eastwood as an actor and director still culturally. So I would agree. I think though that is easier to get into versus like a Once Upon a Time where you're spending at least 3 hours for each film. And I'm not saying Once a Time in America is just like, I haven't seen it, or if I have, it's been way too long since I've seen it, but it definitely has like that time,
Oh yeah,
the time length where it's just
like
like that's
3
an
hours
investment.
47 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the films that I always say, like, for filmmakers, get into it a little later if you know you are interested in seeing these types of styles.
Do not start with Once Upon a Time in America, the extended.
Yeah.
So don't start there if you're,
yeah,
especially if you're younger, and like it, you have to really be invested in cinema, I think, to some extent, to really warrant that time and giving yourself over to longer storylines like that.
yeah. So I agree.
Really
the Clint Eastwood trilogy would be,
yeah,
I think, where you start. Is it Fistful of Dollars is first?
Yep, that's first. That's 64, and then a few dollars more is 65, and then Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is 66. Although, if I remember correctly, those were the release dates overseas. I believe in the United States, all three of those movies came out fairly close together, closer to like 66, 67 for for US
right.
audiences.
I would honestly say, and this is shocking, someone who is just getting into it maybe would like the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly the most out of like when you're first starting it, because
but I feel like you need to see the first two first, because it's kind of like a series. You don't think you saw Good, the Bad, and the Ugly first?
I saw Good, the Bad, and the Ugly first, and maybe it's because that's like definitely usually the most notorious of the three. Like that's the one that most people know. Love. So maybe it's just a chance, like maybe it's because everyone's kind of just so familiar with the Western tropes that like you can just kind of jump into it. Yeah. But yeah, I would honestly maybe say, like, I think it is that trilogy. Maybe Good, Bad, and the Ugly. I know I'm the weird one today, where I'm just choosing the third film in a trilogy is the one you started off with.
I believe, isn't that in like the top 20 or 30 on IMDb is Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? I think that's like on IMDb.
Wouldn't shock me.
Like one of the most beloved movies of all time is that film. Yeah, I think Once Upon a Time in the West is up there too. But yeah, people love The Good, and the Bad, and the Ugly, and I can see why. It's a great movie. That would be my number 2 choice. The only reason Once Upon a Time in America is number 3 is that I've only watched that 4-hour cut once, and it was a while ago. And I remember really being into it, but it's been a long time. So I didn't have time to watch it again the last week. Maybe it would be 2 or even 1 if I watched it again now, because I want to say it was like 10 years ago I watched it, and I've like evolved a little bit in my taste and stuff. Maybe I'd like it even more now, so I'd have to see it again. But yeah, so I would put that at number 3, Good, the Bad, and the Ugly number 2. For me, My Desert Island, if I could only watch one of his films for the rest of time, it'd be Once Upon a Time in the West. I just love that movie. I watched it again for its 50th anniversary in 2018. I watched it one night, and I hadn't seen it in a while, and it just blew me away. And Henry Fonda plays such an effective villain in that movie.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And his comeuppance at the end is just classic, iconic. It's so good. Charles Bronson in that movie, and great cast. And I just think that's like Leone's masterpiece for me, even more so than Good, the Bad, is Once Upon a Time in the West. I just think it's a great flick.
For sure.
Cool. All right, so that takes us to the end here, Ben. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today. If you want to talk about your own podcast, it sounds like you have more than one.
I have one channel that everything goes on.
Oh,
that's probably the
interesting.
Best way.
Okay, so yeah, tell us about your podcast and where our listeners can find you online.
Yes, so guys, you can find me at the podcast feed, Ben and Brand See a Movie. Brand is my co-host. Okay. So it's Ben and Brand See a Movie. We are on iTunes, Spotify, really anywhere you find podcasts, we're on. On there, I have a bunch of shows, the main one being Ben and Brand See a Movie, where we take a movie, we review it each week. We talk about what we liked, what we didn't like. We have some jokes. We make fun of the movie. Right now, we're in the middle of what we're calling, well, I guess when you hear this, it will be the very end of what we're calling Rage Cage, where it is we are just going through true movies of Nicolas Cage's career for a week, leading up to a March Madness style bracket, where we're going to pit all the Cage characters we've watched together, and it's going to be which Cage is left standing. So we're getting some guests on that. So that's going to be really fun.
Real quick, Ben, I want to recommend you. I had a guest on in April about The Beguiled. His name is Keith Phipps. And when we talked in April, he was finishing, or he might have been done with a book that's coming out this fall, but by the time this episode airs, it might already be available. It's coming out in like, I think September or October. It's called Age of Cage. And it's a book about the career of Nicolas Cage. And he goes, I think he said he watched every single film up until 2020.
It would be great to get a cameo from it. So I'm definitely going to go back.
If you're doing a lot of stuff on Nicolas Cage, you might want to reach out to
Mr. I'll definitely
Phipps,
see,
or at least look at his book coming out in the fall. It's definitely be up your alley.
For sure. Thank you for telling me that. But yes, so we're in the middle of that this week, today. Well, I guess, again, it's going to be such a difference when it's released. Yeah. But today being end of July, we just did Vampire's Kiss and Ghost Rider as a double feature.
Okay.
Which was painful in every sense of the word imaginable. That was really a painful week, and it really broke us both. But next week we'll be having The Rock and Con Air as our that.
Oh, cool.
So we're going to be doing that. Cage Off is happening end of August, it sounds like. So we're going to have a bunch of guests on there, some judges, some panelists. We're going to do a whole spectacular from that. And that's what's going on in the podcast. You can also find on there the Beneverse, not the Beneverse, Ben Fellas, which is a interview show that I do with a guest twice a month, and my Star Wars podcast. Now there are two of them I do with my friend Josh Whitney, where we're just talking about the news of Star Wars. The most recent episode, we just talked about the Lego sets of 2021 that are coming out for Star Wars. Mm-hmm. So we're doing all types of stuff over there.
You're busy.
Find me. Yeah, I'm busy. And I work a full-time job. So, since it will be September, follow me on Twitter and Instagram, which will be more updated by September, I promise. Mm-hmm. My Twitter handle is @the_Beneverse, and my Instagram is the.Beneverse. Check me out there. I'll be writing for a few magazines on there, so I'll be sharing all that. That's so much of a plug, and I think I got everything. Check out my YouTube channel, The Beneverse. And thank you for having me on, Brian. I got to have you on my show.
Yeah, be fun.
Closer. Yeah, whenever it's closer to my release date, I'll hit you up and we can see if we can do something together.
Yeah, sounds like a plan for sure. So thanks for being here, Ben. Thanks to all of you for listening. You can find us online at filmat50.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And until next time, remember, 50 never looked this good.